Hi, good evening. It is Tuesday, February 16th, and this is our evening plenary section. Here tonight, we're going to welcome Debra Magpie Earling, who's going to be speaking about Indigenous literary perspectives on the lost journals of Sacagawea. And I'm going to pause the recording for a moment until we're ready to get started. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started here at about 7 o'clock. It looks like we've got a room full of folks here. Debra, we're really delighted to have you here, and we've got a couple of the students, Rachel and Jackson, who are going to go to the respective microphones here, speak really close to the mic and do their introductions to you, and then we'll get underway here. So I'm going to turn the camera so it faces them, and we'll get started.
Can you hear me? Or
Yes.
is it on? Awesome. Debra Magpie Earling is a novelist, short story writer, and professor of Native American Studies and Fiction here at the University of Montana. She's also a member of the Bitterroot Salish tribe. She was born in Spokane, Washington, but grew up in Montana on the Flathead Reservation in Polson. At age 18, she became the first public defender in the tribal justice system on the Flathead Reservation here in Montana. She received her Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Washington in Spokane. From there, she went on to Cornell and received her Master's in English and her Master's of Fine Arts in Fiction. Debra Magpie Earling became the first Native American director of the University of Montana's Creative Writing Program in 2016.
Her 2002 novel, Permared, has won multiple awards, including the Western Writers Association Spur Award and the Western Writers of America Medicine Pipe Bearer Award for Best First Novel. Her other work includes The Lost Journals of Sacagawea, which is a photographic collaboration that reinvents the life of Sacagawea. She also has various stories published in The Last Best Place, a Montana anthology, Talking Leaves, Contemporary Native American Short Stories, Circle of Women, Anthology of Western Women Writers, and Wild Women, Anthology of Women Writers. In 2006, she received a literature fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. In 2007, she received a Guggenheim Fellowship. Professor Earling is a gifted author and pioneer in Native American and women's literature, and we are excited to welcome her into our class today for her presentation titled Indigenous Literary Perspectives, The Lost Journals of Sacagawea. Welcome.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. I really appreciate your introducing me. I actually I did go to Spokane Falls Community College, but I went to the University of Washington, was where I did my undergrad work, and then later Cornell for my MFA. And then years later, I returned to the university to begin teaching in Native American Studies and English. And so tonight I wanted to talk about something that from the questions that I got from I received 10 questions that Professor Spencer sent to to me, and I think they were just brilliant questions. I don't know if I have any expertise to answer them at all. I think they sound like maybe they're questions that are more maybe for Professor Lapierre and some of the historians that came before me. Tonight, what I'd like to do is present to you the side of the story of Sacagawea that hopefully will make her become human to you. Will pull her from mythology and make you see something deeper and grander about her. One of the things that I've noticed when I've been, I got into writing the Lost Journals, and I kind of give a little history. I was asked by the preeminent historian Alvin Josephi to write something like a long essay on Lewis and Clark, and what the Salish, what the Salish saw in Lewis and Clark. And so I began writing And it was painstaking. It was something I didn't want to do, but I admired Josephi so much. And if you get an opportunity, he's one of those rare historians who can really capture something. And Josephi's kind of interesting. He was never a wannabe Indian. He never wanted to be Nez Perce, but he admired the Nez Perce Indians and gave so much to the history of this area and the history of Indians in the Northwest. And his focus was in Nez Perce. So when he asked me if I would write, I just admired him for so long. If he had asked me if I'd write, this essay, I decided to, and I plunged in. And it became for me kind of I'm hesitant to say this, but it became a mystical journey almost, something that I could not have even imagined. And I began to recall things that I'd done years before. I had taken, it was around 1992, just before I began teaching at the university. I took a trip up the Missouri River with a group of artists, and we were following Lewis and Clark. We were following the expedition. And one of the things that has haunted me, and perhaps has haunted you if you know about the expedition, is the curious death of Meriwether Lewis. And I used to think that I had a morbid imagination, like I was really focused on the morbid things. And then I realized, and I'm coming to realize that what I'm really focused on is life, how we live our lives and what we leave behind, the important things that we leave to others. And I think I was traveling with a Crow artist, Susan Stewart, who just has an amazing vision. And we were traveling. We were traveling together. We were the only Native women in the boat, and it was kind of a luxurious affair. But we found ourselves hanging out with each other and speaking to each other pretty much solely as we were traveling along. And one of the things that we were really curious about is what had happened to Meriwether Lewis. His death, and I think it was a suicide, really weighed on me. And I wondered if he was the spearhead of Manifest Destiny. What he and Lewis and Clark did was open up the American West in ways that have brought so much death and so much hardship and so much difficulty to the peoples along, especially the women, along the corridor where they passed, and opening up that passage. And I wondered if he too, because he was, if you have read anything about him, he was a very kind of introspective and solitary man. He would think a lot and said a lot of things. So in this, if I may, I will be reading a few things. And in this book, that the Lewis and Clark Through Indian Eyes, in the essay I wrote, I was not fascinated with his life as much as I was interested in the mystery of his death, whether he was murdered or took his own life. I remembered his reflections on his 31st year, and here's in quotations. I reflected that I had done very little indeed to further the happiness of the human race or to advance information for succeeding generations. So he has this kind of prescient vision of things, which I thought was kind of astonishing, as he's traveling up this river. And in my culture, the river tells stories. If you listen and you're quiet, you sit by the river and you can ask the river a question. And if you listen carefully, the river will answer you. So it was kind of something happened that on the last night of our journey along the Missouri River, and the Missouri River is just like this great moving, if you've ever had the opportunity to travel on that river, and this was years ago before a lot of people were out on the river. And I thought the journey was profound. On the last night, there was this extraordinary thunderstorm. And I remember just I could hear the thunder in the distance, and then you saw the lightning, and you could tell, how close the thunderstorm was getting to us. The lightning was, and here we were in our tents in those, aluminum poles. And I thought we were going to get fried in this tent. So I told Susan, wake up, we've got to get out of here and find some shelter. We got to get out of this tent. And so we, the people who were organizing our journey, gathered us all in this kind of lean-to, and there were rattlers in this lean-to, and I remember there was like this mouse that was kind of cowering in the corner, and we looked down the river, and I will never forget this sight. It looked like every flash of lightning illuminated the whole river, but in the most curious way. It illuminated that river like a man was walking down the length of that river. And you could actually see, it made an outline of a strike of lightning and a man moving forward along the river as lightning. And I believe, as a writer and a storyteller and a Salish woman, I believe in the power of nature telling us stories and nature communicating things to us. And that night I was struck by that image. It seemed to me that all along this journey, we were kind of traveling and trying to figure out, what we would write, how we would recreate this moment or reflect back on Lewis and Clark. And I realized the destruction that was coming down the river. And it really hit me. And it was so vivid and so true. So just a year later, the bicentennial commemoration for Lewis and Clark appeared at MAM, at the Missoula Art Museum. And Laura Millen, the director of MAM, asked me if I would contribute a piece, if I would write something for these artists, these Native artists who had written, who had all this art on display. And man, I have never written for art. And I said, I just don't want to do it. No, I don't want to write about Lewis and Clark. It was such a painful experience writing that essay. And then they said, you can write whatever you want, please, just whatever comes to mind, you can write it. And I decided to just go ahead and write it. And I remember I went to visit my folks, and I was in this coffee shop in Spokane, and I took out this journal and I started writing, and I wrote the Lost Journals of Sacagawea, and I scratched it out, and I scratched it, and then I wrote it again. And it occurred to me, it just came, like I've never written anything like that before. The whole story came to me in half an hour. And so they printed it up as sideboard and showed it. And it was about the story of Sacagawea. Wasn't reflecting really, kind of in some ways reflected what was going on in the paintings and the artwork. But Peter Koch, who is a master printer, an artist, came through and he saw it, and he decided to get in touch with me. He wanted to work with me on making a book. And so he looked at it, and I did not, there are things in this life that I think are really inexplicable. But he asked me for a few more things. He wanted something on the buffalo. I wanted more on the buffalo. And he wanted me to just sit and think about it a little bit more. He wanted a few more pages. And I ended up writing, I think like 15 more pages. And the strange thing about it was I wrote this whole book that Peter Koch made into a museum piece book in 45 minutes. And so, but it felt like, and I understand that there are things that are gifts. And I'm going to tell you some stories because I'm a storyteller. I don't consider myself a historian, but I know that storytellers bear the deeper and more human history of people in the world, and especially Native people. Something happened, and I always tell my students, in my storytelling class, you can choose to believe this or not. I'm not so sure I believe it. I just know that I experienced it. I was writing for Peter, and I remember waking up one night, and it looked like years ago, the television used to have this fuzz on it, like television static, and the room was lit with that kind of static. The room felt charged and electric, and it was dark. It was, in the middle of the night, but I could see all these particles, and I saw a woman standing next to the bed, and she had long hair, braids. She was a Native woman, and she pointed to this cage that she had at her feet. And I wasn't afraid. So I think about that, and that would scare me now, but I had a pen beside my bed. I scribbled in the dark, and I fell asleep. I dropped it and I fell asleep. And the next morning, my mother called me, and my mother said, did you hear there's some really terrific news? She said, the Smithsonian has released a sacred fox of the Blackfeet. And they released it from the Lewis and Clark expedition that was sent back. This powerful sacred fox has been returned. And I looked at, I kind of was listening to my mother, and I thought, I think I wrote about that last night, Mom. And I hung up and I went to the bed, and next to the bed, I had this, and I'm going to read this to you. And I didn't, this doesn't have, this is exactly how I wrote it and how it came out. If I can. Traps. They are trapping the animals. Lewis and Clark are sending fox to the great white father. They have trapped a spirit fox, a fox that carries the weighted soul of a man possessed by bad spirits. Meriwether places the caged fox at the edge of camp every day because his cage is foul as pig's blood, he says. But I know Meriwether is afraid. Every night, the caged fox moves. When night fastens the moon-heavy water to spirits, when light sifts down in dark currents, and the river begins chanting, do not look there, at the bottom there, along the lip of shore, water channeling the thing not named, the dim sky water carries is older than time, older than blood, bigger. In the deepest still place of the river, fox is chanting. Sparkling scales of fish scattering silt, beaver slit currents. Fox conjures sparks of waves, smoothing stones. Fox gnashes his teeth, his black mouth open, his teeth so white I chatter in sleep. They can't put his cage far enough away from me. In the dark, he is a thing moving. I wake, his rattling cage beside me, fox whispering, a harsh wind low. I have opened the cage door, he remains. Fox blood is sour, his small head wounded. I'm afraid of his teeth, his grim shining eyes. Mostly, I am afraid of his voice. He could kill me with his stories. I bludgeoned my wife, he tells me. I broke the blood of her flesh. I broke the thin bones of her fingers for touching another man. I branded her ribs with fists. I stabbed her with a fire stick blazing to sear her to me. She turned so many colors, the sky could no longer please me. Who is she, I ask. Wife for dark nights, he answers. Wife for dark nights, wife for dark nights, wife for dark nights, wife for dark nights. The curious thing about that story is I think I thought a lot about Sacagawea as not as a, you know, history is an interesting thing. I didn't know how interesting and how fussy it is until I really started looking into the story of Sacagawea. Some say she was 16 years old at the time Lewis and Clark came. Others say she was 18. Some say she's 20. I dispute that in my novel, which is fiction, but I dispute it for this reason. And Clark, his bride to be, his fiance, was 12 years old at the time he left Virginia to meet with Lewis to go on to go upriver, up the Missouri, to go on the journey. 12 years old. That means that Judith had to have courted her when she was 10 or 11. I started thinking about the ways in which we get glimpses of how Sacagawea might appear. I think I put her at a really young age. She was a child when she was taken by the Hidatsa. They don't know what they say, 17. I keep saying that figure, 1788. That's when she was born. And then recently I found 1789. And I realized they don't know. But it really looks, it doesn't look good to say that she was young. And I believe she was young because she was captured as a slave and taken. So with other young girls and boys as well. So I was thinking about her life and writing about that and writing about the trauma that she experienced. And, you know, I kind of wanted to, in some ways, get away from Sacagawea. And writing is a curious thing. And many of you I know on EVST are writers. And I encourage you to write and I encourage you to pick up the pen and write and to let things come out of you and to see what happens, to connect with that big wonder that is your subconscious. And, you know, Joseph Campbell knows in some ways that we connect to the big stories. But I have had some really wonderful and wondrous experiences writing this book. I recently, which is a rare thing, I recently, in the last month, I received news from my agent that Daniel Slager from Milkweed has bought the partial of this as a novel of The Lost Journals of Sacagawea. There's so in my so I am going on this journey whether I want to or not, and it's funny what calls to you. It's not always the things that you really want to write. I have many students who want to write a lot of things, but a lot of times what really claims you are stories that must be told and stories that are important not only to humanity but for our understanding, for in some ways our path forward, we need to deeply consider, we need to meaningfully think about stories and bring some stories and history to life. And when we do, it's curious how I know that as environmental students, maybe you studied the secret life of trees and the ways in which trees can speak to us, which I would have thought was a little kind of unbelievable, I guess, because it was an idea so dear to my heart when I was a child. And I think about, I'm going to make a connection between these two things. Writing in that deeper connection to the roots of stories, to our heart's blood, that's connected to all the stories that all of our ancestors have held, both the grief and the sorrow, all of the joyous stories, all the beloved stories, all those tales. Everything that you experience is part of that, is in your blood and in your genetic code. And doesn't that sound like the wildest thing? But it's true. And scientifically proven. I love that idea. And just as they're learning more about the connection between trees, recently I had the great privilege of staying up at the Yellow Bay Biological Station, and I stayed there in the fall. And you know, at the station, there's like one. I believe there's just one scientist who was there with me, and then the groundskeeper, and everyone else left on the weekends. So out there, if you've ever been to Yellow Bay, out there on that, out there on that isthmus, you're alone, and there's so many, there's grizzlies that visit, and so I'd walk along the shore, and I had one experience where the birds were like swooping and singing, and kind of, they weren't trying to harm me. Didn't feel like I was near their nest, but they were like warning me, it felt like, and they were swooping and swirling and chittering. And I thought, well, that's strange. And then I went a little bit further, and there was the chipmunks and the squirrels came out and were like just really at me, like really angry, but not like warning, like just they'd come out on the edge of the branch and at me. And I was like, what is this? And as I walked further, I noticed there was a tree that the branch was down, and there was one leaf, and this leaf was waving like this. And I looked, and there was no other thing, and I thought, is there some kind of bug on that? Or I went closer, and this leaf, I put my hand around it, and it still kept going like this. And I thought, can the trees connect with you in some ways and tell you things? And as I walked just a little bit further, I saw scat, and I saw the biggest scat I had ever seen. It was like this fresh big scat, and it had whole cherries in it. And I was like, that's a grizzly, and I just kind of backed away. But I thought about those animals, and I thought about the ways in which, if we listen and we're quiet and we pay attention, and my elders have always told me that if you pay attention and you're humble on this earth, you'll see signs. And I think scientists have been aware of this biologists have been aware of this for a long time. But in terms of bringing that back to the idea of story, I believe that in some ways I have been given that gift of story for this particular story, and the roots of that story go really deep, and they're connected in so many ways. I'm going to tell you another story, and this one is really peculiar because I started writing about a woman at Mandan Camp, and I had this image of this woman, and all along the river, she asked that mirrors be placed along the river so she could see the spirits that move in the river, the water spirits. And so I thought, like, why am I'm hung up on that idea. And I had this idea that Sacagawea, when she began menstruating, was sent to this woman because she was going to run away and they had to keep catching her. And so she's sent to this woman, this old woman. And this old woman has these mirrors. She asks for mirrors from whenever the traders come through, she asks for mirrors. And her old, weathered gown is filled with mirrors. And when she thinks something, and like an image will pass through the mirrors, I thought, this is so strange. This is too weird. It doesn't. And I'd never read about the Mandans. I'd never studied them. They were not on my radar. I didn't study any of their culture, their heritage. And I knew this woman was named She Who Has Always Lived. And I picked up a book when I was doing research, and I was looking at the ceremonies of the Mandan Indians. And there was a woman, the woman who has always lived. I find those things fascinating. And I find that even if there's some thread, some small thread where I came across that story, which I'm pretty sure I would have remembered that story. That would have been a story that really would have fascinated me. That's still connected to me somehow and showed up somehow in my work and showed up as story. So as I go through this story, the Lost Journals, I am, I'm just kind of humbled, truly humbled by all of the stories within in this narrative. Another interesting thing that happened, and sometimes I tell my students, if you're, and this goes for many things, if you're on the right path, the door kind of opens. If things aren't happening for you, it means maybe you need to sit still for a while and think about things and just consider, take it as a moment to get deeper, dig in deeper and think more clearly. But one thing that happened that was also another curious thing about this story. Sacagawea was there's and you've heard this from the other speakers, but she became just as Lewis and Clark are, she became truly a mythical figure. Like there's stories about her, like where she died at the age of 23, and there's stories where she lived to be 80 or 100 years old. And but there's a story that Charles Eastman went to determine if she was indeed Sacagawea. And Dr. Charles Eastman, was an Omaha Indian. He was revered for his knowledge and for his science, and he came to the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, and Sacagawea had died, but he interviewed all these people, and he determined that Poivro, that was her name, that she was indeed Sacagawea, that she hadn't died. Now, the interesting thing about that is, so many ways it's interesting, but for me, one of the things that they discovered was that this woman, who he thought was Sacagawea, had written journals as well. And those journals were lost in a fire at the Wind River Reservation when the agency caught fire. So it was like the lost journals of Sacagawea, like all of these things began to fit together and to stick in a way. So, you know, I wanted to read some things that I think, you know, as we look at the history of Lewis and Clark, one of the things to remember, I think someone asked me a question, and it was, let me see if I can find it. I think it's TED by Jack Cooney, and it says, my question for the speaker tonight is, everyone knows the whitewashed version of the Lewis and Clark expedition, where they explored westward with the help of Sacagawea, but what steps are necessary to promote the indigenous side of the story of Sacagawea rather than the one told by white colonists? And there was other story. There was other questions along that line. You know, how do we tell a story? And I'm going to give you some advice as a writer, not as a scholar. I always feel like the writers, when you're in an MFA program and when you enter the academy, we kind of snuck in there because writers are, you know, really creative. A lot of poets write, they're more scholarly, but I think when fiction writers, we pay attention to stories. Like, stories are what drive us and motivate us. And so we teach the craft and the art of writing your stories, collecting stories. And so along that line, you know, how do we tell the right story? How do we know we're telling the right story? And I think the one thing is that Leslie Marmon Silko in Storyteller talks about that everyone needs to tell their stories, that the story of, it's not necessarily the universe, the story of the world will not be complete until everyone tells their story. And so I think it's really important that there's a multiplicity of views, that there's a multiplicity of stories. Writers have the privilege, and it's a unique honor when you write about a historical figure, bringing that figure to life, trying to imagine what that figure, what that person has gone through. If we look through the lens of history and we begin to like read between the lines, you know, and I was reading and I've read the journals of Sergeant Gass. I've read the journals of Lewis and Clark. And as I was reading them, there's something, you know, just so incredible about that journey. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do as scholars, as people who care about the environment. I'm going to ask you to think about, like, when you read history, question, like, begin to think of it through the lens of humanity in your deepest heart. Begin to see, like, what it must have been. You know, when I began to think about Sacagawea, I started thinking about, okay, so no matter what age she was, there is no doubt that she was a traditional woman. She knew how to take care of things. She knew the plant. She knew how to identify things. I grew up, I worked in the Salish Culture Committee. I was told stories by my elders that years ago, and we've lost that ability, but what we used to be like the bear. And we were like the animals who could blend in with nature. And if you've ever been near a bear, the biologist for my tribe used to tell me, hey, there's all these grizzlies up at Post Creek. You can go see them, maybe. You think Post Creek, like there's just bushes out there. But those bears are so stealthy that they can, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, and it's a wondrous thing. Have you ever seen a bear come out of the brush and it appears and it's huge, like a big bear? I used to get that all the time. I had a cabin up on the Flathead. This bear used to come out of the brush, and I'd call my husband over and say, hey, look at that bear. And that bear would go back into the woods and just disappear. Like, it's there. I just can't see it because it can blend in so well. So I thought about Sacagawea and the ways in which she understood that traditional world. And she understood a world that was made of medicine bundles and power, connection to nature. She understood how to survive. She was a very young woman and she knew how to survive. And I want you to think about, when you've taken your track up hiking, just for a short time with the gear that you have, I want you to imagine what it would be like to be a young woman who's just given birth and you're carting a baby. You don't have diapers. You're surrounded by randy men. You have to sleep in the same cabin or area near Lewis and Clark, so you're not raped by the men who are around you. This is the kind of atmosphere that she was in. Now imagine that you're a woman, a Native woman, and they're wrapping up bundles to send back to the Great White Father. And you know what a medicine bundle is. So the confusion of that at first. There's another thing that I think isn't true at all, is that they said she speaks, in all the history books, it says she spoke Hidatsa and she spoke Shoshone. And I thought, boy, she spoke French, she spoke English, she probably spoke Spanish, she's probably spoke many different languages. She was really young. And, she had to be quiet. She couldn't reveal what she knew. But I wonder sometimes if she did reveal who she was to York, or if York knew, because he was a man, a Black man. He was also a slave. He knew Sacagawea was a slave. She wasn't a wife. And the two of them shared something. And I have often wondered, in reading just beyond the lip of the pages, when you read history, you begin to see the human element of it. Like what was really happening, what was really going on. I'll look at the time. Along those lines, I wanted to read something that also caught my eye. I don't know whether you have encountered this book by Thomas P. Slaughter. It's called Exploring Lewis and Clark, Reflection of Men and the Wilderness. Some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read are in this book. But in 1804, in August of 1804, in Lewis and Clark, a party of 10 armed members of the expedition set out to explore a mountain of evil spirits that people from several Indian tribes had told them about. So Clark and his men went to examine this outcropping, and it's near Vermilion, South Dakota. And so they went to look at this, enormous outcropping, this rock outcropping. And Clark wrote in his journal entry for the day, it was a solitary hill and a vast open expanse of plains. But the one thing that the people were afraid of this place, and they said, they didn't say there were devils there. They said there were little people there, and Clark interpreted it as devils. And these little people, they said, will shoot arrows at you and kill you. And this is one of the few times in the journal that Lewis and Clark actually acknowledge any of the stories. And I find that that's such a loss. And I believe one of the questions that was asked by one of you was, what would I do? How would I change things? How do I, how do I envision a better community? And you know what, I worked for Peace and Justice, and I worked in the Peace and Justice Center. I worked, as a public defender in the tribal court system. I worked for, really hard, fought a hard battle for a long time. And I have come to understand that those things are important. That there's a really important and compelling argument to be made for the power of stories, not only from my own community, because stories help people live. Stories save people in the coldest of winter. When they were starving, the storytellers would begin to tell stories. So people were able to focus on something else. In the dark days of this pandemic, we too have longed for stories. We long for connection with other people. Never underestimate that the stories that you are seeking, the history that you look toward and that you look backward at is about human beings. And what is between the lines? What is really being said in those stories? If I think the world can be changed, and I sure hope so. I just heard the devastating news that House Bill 102, just like GN40 just signed it into law. I find that devastating. It's about guns on campus. And so I think that how we will survive as a people is by uniting and telling each other our stories and deeply connecting to one another. For years, I taught a storytelling class at the University of Montana. I used to teach through Native American literature, and I had students, they said it was like an AA meeting. I never called on anyone. Silence, I believe, tells its own story. So I'd have a class of sometimes 125 people, and I would sit down and I'd ask people to come up to the stage and tell me their story. Like, what's your story? And if we share those stories now, and if we look through the lens of history back to the stories that that inhabit this area, we'll have a better understanding. And I believe that's what I'm charged to do as a writer. Not always so much fun, but certainly important. So I've been talking and talking, and it's almost 7:50. So Dan, if you don't mind, I'd like to take some questions, if that's okay.
All right, let me see if I can get this back on the gallery spoke here. I'm dealing with multiple devices here, Deborah, so let's see if I can get the right ones here. Let's see if we can get that here.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, what our tradition has been is to ask the two students who did introduce you, Rachel and Jackson, to get us started with the questions there, and we've got microphones here. So Rachel and Jackson, do either one of you want to go ahead and get us started with a question, and then we'll just open it up for discussion from there.
Thank you.
And did they claim that she was born to their tribe, or was it just the tired interpreter that perpetuated the wrong story?
Could you, I couldn't hear that. Could someone interpret that for me?
Yeah, let me just check to make sure the mic is on. Sometimes these mics don't work that well. Got turned off. Try it one more time here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now. Thank you.
Oh, awesome. So has there been much of an attempt to widely clarify that Sacagawea was born Hidatsa and only captured by the Shoshone? It seems like everywhere I looked, all the different sources said she was born Shoshone, like Encyclopedia Britannica, Wikipedia, all the basic places.
Yes.
And then do the Shoshone claim that she was born to their tribe, or was it just the tired interpreter that perpetuated the wrong story?
Well, thank you for your question. And yeah, I love that it's that her life is story. I believe the Lemhi Shoshone. There's no reason not to believe them. Their story seems the most compelling because Clark, and Lewis, Gass, those men weren't terribly imaginative, and so they spoke about how moved she was when she returned. When she saw her brother Kamiawet, and I believe she's Lemhi Shoshone. And someone asked the question, what is Sacagawea's what is her indigenous name? And the Lemhi Shoshone call her Sacagawea.
Right.
Was there another part of that question?
Jackson, you want to follow up with the question here, and then we'll get other folks ready to move on here. I have to say, while Jackson's getting ready, Deborah, that it was so interesting reading through all the different questions the students have put together, because there's clearly so much interest in knowing so much more about Sacagawea. But I think, at least like for my Western style education, trained that there must be one right way, one right history kind of thing. And what I loved about what you were doing tonight was just, filling out. I mean, the storytelling is a whole nother way of filling out that story in ways that draws our attention to other details that sort of the straight narration history glosses over or ignores completely on that. But Jackson, go ahead and your question here.
Yeah, my question's kind of along that same vein. I was just interested by the readings just to learn about, it seems like there's a lot of controversy surrounding the death of Sacagawea, and it was just interesting to me that, I don't know, someone's death would have like this controversy kind of surrounding it, like these two sides that are arguing, whether she died here or she died here. And I guess I was kind of wondering where that stems from, and kind of how that, yeah, just, I guess because there's no definitive answer.
Yeah, thank you. It is fascinating, isn't it? Because we pretty much know what happened to the other. Well, some of the core members disappeared, and I forget which ones, Juilliard or something, where they can't find what happened to him. I have my own theory about it. This is it's my imagination, but and I think we have to bring our imagination to play into what could have possibly happened. I believe that what happened, if you look at it, the Hidatsa story doesn't hold water to me. And why doesn't is, so if she was this beloved person who they rescued and brought back to their tribe, then why was she sold or gambled into slavery to Charbonneau, who was much older than she was? Doesn't make sense. So I believe I believe the Shoshone, the Lemhi Shoshone, were her people. there's, you know, and it's so telling when she returns, when she finally returns home, she's overjoyed. Her joy cannot be contained. It moves everyone. And she cries to see her brother. She's, you know, elated to be home again. You know, just as if I can't even imagine what that would be like to return like that. And then her husband to be, she was selected at like years when she was a child to, she was betrothed to, the story is that she was betrothed to a man. And when he saw her, that she was with child and that she had a child from a non-Indian, from a white man, he didn't want her. And it, I think it broke her heart. I think she just longed to get back and was so excited to come home. And you know what she did? She got back in that boat and she's like, I'm going onward. I'm going to go to the ocean. So she, you know, if she was 14 years old or if she was 20 years old, she had this incredible will. Like, I am going forward and I'm, you know, and after, I'm sorry, it would be like taking a baby through all that. I can't even imagine. Um, Taking a child and then saying we're going forward again. So she showed some real initiative, and I just believe that, just from everything that I read, and when you listen to the Shoshone, it's interesting. But there's one thing that kind of seals the deal for me, and this is, I don't know. I'm sure the Hidatsis would not like me very much, the Mandans, but do you know where Sacagawea, where she was taken to Knife River along those villages? I think it was I can't remember what year it was. Recently in modern history, they flooded. They flooded that whole area. They just covered all that area up with water. They just got rid of it. And you know what they called that place? What the name of that is? Sacagawea Reservoir. And I thought, wow, if you had some, you know, if you had the kind of like, if you were stolen, a stolen sister, and taken to a place where the stories are horrific that I read about Mandan Camp, um, and you had like a seething kind of distrust of people, and you finally were heading home, and what you would maybe even unwillingly, and not wanting to, wish, when you left that area, like you would not want to see it. They also, interestingly, are the people of the water. So they return to the water. So it could be a good sign that, you know, the place went back to the water. But there's horrible photographs of the Mandan leadership. Probably, I think it's in the 1970s, maybe the 1960s. But when they were flooded over, it's heartbreaking to see those images. But it made me wonder. It made me wonder about, you know, retribution, power of, you know, the power of enormous grief and what that can do. And that's my storytelling side.
Need to see if there's got other folks who want to come up to a microphone and question or comment or tell your own story. Mark, right ahead.
Dr. Eastling, thank you, first of all, for gracing us with the lecture. This is kind of a broader question. In storytelling, you kept referring to the similarities. As a storyteller, or in this class with our writing, does a good storyteller, good writer, try to stimulate connections of similarity, or try to portray the similarities between the here and now with the historical base?
Hmm. That's a wonderful question, and one that I don't feel even qualified to answer, but I'll take a stab at it, I think. I think when when you write, at least for me, and I hope for my students, that you want to impart something to the world that is meaningful and important. And we have this tendency to believe that we're different, that we're different because we're in the modern world and we have technology and we're not like those backward people back then. And and I find myself in that trap too, like, oh, well, those people back then. And then you look at extraordinary things, like if you've ever visited Turkey, or seen like layers upon layers of thousands of years of civilization, the kinds of extraordinary ideas that people were talking about and meaning about, and just enormous, sort of this great big beautiful world. And so if you're alert to the stories that you're telling, um, you know, you make those connections because it's a human connection, and you make if you're writing it historically, you make that history come alive. Um, and and you make that history come alive. When they say, like, you've heard that a million times, write what you know, and people have disputed that, and it's gone out of favor. But when I think about write about what you know, I think it's a human experience. It's like, what it's like to feel grief. You know what it's like when a room stills after death. You know what it's like to embrace joy. You know what it's like to look at a nephew or a niece, or see a baby that's new to this world. You know what it's like to see your mother or your father greet you when they haven't seen you for a long time. You know what it's like to break somebody's heart. You know what it's like to be cruel to someone. We all know this. And so, to write honestly about those human kinds of emotions, and historically capture those times, and also understand that at those times there's certain things that weren't quite the way they are today, but the human experience has always been the same.
Let's see if anyone else wants to walk up to the mic here. Oh,
From
sorry. Go ahead, Ray.
from Zoomland, maybe.
Go ahead.
Yes, I had a question. Reference the different sources for Sacagawea and her description. They obviously came across numerous native tribes on their way to the Pacific. What we read was of the Shoshone and the Mandan Hidatsa. Did you run across any other tribes' descriptions of her, and do those stories further muddle the picture, or do they clear anything up, possibly from other tribes that may have described her and her contributions?
From what I can tell, where was it when they get to Fort Clatsop? It's always through the journal. It's always through the journals of the men on the corn. I think Sergeant Gass. I believe he's the one who says, it may be Ordway, but says something about her youth, about her being young, which makes me go, if they're what does that really mean? What did she really look like? We don't know what she looks like. But I don't believe that that we see images of her, and I think that you had wasn't there an artist that came to lecture and showed images of Sacagawea, like artistic representations of her. I've always been kind of astonished by those. Because they make her look, a lot of them make her look like she's really elderly, kind of about 40 years old, or sort of. But I think she was like really spry and young, and I can't imagine walking the miles that she put in with a baby on her back, and the kinds of sleep she must not have gotten. So I think I've kind of rambled off your question, but I hope I answered some of it, Raymond.
Deborah, I'm wondering what a question I have is that you really bridge different kinds of storytelling in terms of you come from a tradition of oral storytelling, and now you do written storytelling. And do you find any tensions, anything going back and forth between the stories that you've heard since you were a child from family members and from your community and things, and then transcribing that into the written word?
Fortunately, I've come from incredible storytellers. So my mother was a storyteller, and so was my Auntie Virginia. And they would tell stories they would tell stories into the night, especially my Aunt Virginia. Um, she could tell stories that just made you feel like I remember as a child, we'd just listen and like rapt attention. Some of the stories that I have to say that I've read, I worked for the culture committee when I was at the University of Washington. I came back as a kind of as a scholar and went through the old stories and tried to help with, transcribing some of them. And uh, I was really disappointed because those, if you look at those old coyote stories and they're, I think what happened is from everything that I can gather is the language is so rich and so like, and the culture is so rich. So when someone like years ago would say, we were aligned with the land itself. So when someone would say, meet me at whatever, it was so specific that you didn't need directions. You knew where to meet someone. So I think that somewhere along the way, through those translations that we got from Kroger or, who else is some of the anthropologists who I think we lost something really important, and that was the deeper message of understanding the landscape and writing from a place that you know. So I think as a writer, what I do is I try to capture place. I try to capture the memory of place and how place is indelibly um, fixed with stories and memories of stories. And Montana is notorious for that. We have crosses on the road that mark where people have died, but then there's the stories of those people. And, this is such a memoried and storied place. It's a story haunted landscape. So I just kind of hook into that, I think.
Deborah, I was wondering if, and if you don't want me to, I certainly don't have to, but I have a couple images here of the parchment of the book of the Lost Journals of Sacagawea, and I wondered if I could just put them on the share screen, and you might comment a little bit about that, and tell us a little bit again more about how the it evolved at the museum part of that.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Let me see if I can pull these up here real quick.
Okay.
So here's one, and I think this one has the front piece, and then talks about the sort of the history of the story behind it a little bit on that.
Those images, that was an image that Peter Koch found. And I love his sense of, like when you look at that photograph, there's so much symmetry to it. It's an interesting, it's really an interesting, it's just really interesting how he composed that picture and how the teepee comes up in that way. People have actually asked, is that Sacagawea like this? Is that Sacagawea? As if they believe bought this story that it is like, and so I think Peter Koch, if you look at that, book, it's about, I have a copy here, but it's about like this big how, and it opens up at like a parfleche. It looks like buffalo paper. If you see, it looks like buffalo hide. But it's paper that he had to send away to Minnesota to get this smoked paper. It took them a long time to make that paper that looks like hide. The first time, if you want to scroll down, there's I think they have the side of it, the book itself, like what it looks like on the edge. He, yeah, just a little bit more. I think they have yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Right here. So it looks like a parfleche, but he had originally, he had, what do you call it? Yeah, I met him in San Francisco and he was so excited to show me the original prototype. And he had those big pony beads, they were, and it just looked like, have you ever seen that the Japanese did a lot of art, like Native American medallions and stuff? And I said, it looks like that. It doesn't. And I said, get bone beads if you can find them, and spent cartridge shells. I said that should be so his wife, Susan Filter, literally shot those cartridges and, made that. Originally, I this sounds weird, but originally the book sold for $3,500. So the University of Montana has one. So if you want to go look at it, you can make an appointment to go see it, I guess. But it's sold out. Now it's had a 65 print run. It was selling for $7,500, and now I hear it sells for $30,000. A copy of that. So it's a artwork. And so all of those letters, like if you look at the letterpress that, and the photographs, and all of those photographs on that page, when you look at each page, it bleeds through the next page. So you can see through the page. And and there's the casing. So it goes from, the past to kind of contemporary, what she saw. And I thought Sacagawea was prophetic and she saw what was coming. There's another image that the Arizona has. And they have, I like how he did this too. See the cracked glass, like he just took the picture of that. The remarkable thing that he did, if you could see the one from Arizona, if you go to see the original, it has a picture of a group of, I'm not sure, I don't know what tribe it is even. What Peter did was he had the equipment to go deep into a photograph. So the photographs that you see in this book have really never been seen before. He took photographs from deep within the background of the photo and pulled them and made them come to the forefront. So they are the picture. And there's one that looks like druids. They're wearing these, I've never seen images like this. They're, at camp, and we found some of those images. I went to Cheney Cowell's museum and discovered some of their images there, and we compiled a bunch of images. And from that, Peter put those images together, and we talked a lot. I think there was 2 words that were changed. Yeah, look at this. The image of that, it's kind of otherworldly, really beautiful, stark. Yeah, now I forgot what I was going to say. But working with him was an amazing collaboration. He went through my work. He'd say, I'd like to have this. And so I wrote, I'd write it, but it just flew out of me. I wanted the scratch-ins left. So if I couldn't choose the right word, but I thought, well, there's many words to describe. So I used the underline or the out, like strikeouts, because I thought, there's many words to describe one thing, but Yeah, so I don't know if it has strikeouts on that, but he he left all of those in. There's one thing that he changed, and it was he recommended there were like two words. One was I had when the buffalo are gone, the people will be lonesome or something like that. And he goes, no, 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 too sentimental, too like, yeah, that's not good. And he said that oh, the prairie will be lonesome. He said, no, the prairie will die, Deborah. The prairie will die. And he was right. He was a, just an amazing person to collaborate with. He also collaborated with Toni Morrison. So putting books together, I mean, I just felt like I was, in the company of kings with him. He's an amazing, amazing artist. It's a, and it's extraordinary to me. I just never thought that something like that would happen for me. I just never thought I would get that kind of opportunity.
So there is one copy of the Lost Journals here. Is it in the Mansfield Library or is it in the?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I've just seen some of the different individual plates sometimes, but it's really just a stunning visual compilation. So I was happy to come across at least a little bit of it online there, just to sort of get a little bit of the flavor of what you're putting together on that. But
Yeah, go take a look at that book. They have it on display. They pull it out and put it in the case every once in a while. But Megan Stark, will help you get that. Yeah, it's. But I was thinking, maybe they should sell it and buy some journals.
no, I'm so happy we have one. Deborah, we just have a couple minutes left. I'm wondering if you just have any closing thoughts for this. We've got this whole room full of young storytellers here who are starting off on their own journeys on this here. And if you have any advice or thoughts for them as they head on out.
I'm so excited for you all. You're in a wonderful place where you can discover stories. Here's some advice that I would give you. A lot of times writers feel, or we feel as historians, that everything has been covered on that subject. I can't even write about it anymore. And just when you think that, if you look at Lewis and Clark, just go in the library and look at Lewis and Clark, or look at Sacagawea, look at all the books that they have on her. Just remember that those are in those cracks within those books, there's a world, there's a wonder house of stories, and they're waiting for you to discover them. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. These old stories are, they need your attention, and they need your care, and they need you to tell them. So don't shy away from them. But it was such an honor and a privilege to meet with all of you. I'm excited that you're in environmental studies. I'm grateful to you. We need you in this world to carry on and fight the good fight, and make this world save all the things you can in this world. It's really a dear world. So thank you for inviting me to your class.
Thank you so much. Let's give one round of.
Thank you.
So, Deborah, thank you so much. And really, really a real gift for us. And enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right.